Ethan Carter always believed his life was on the right track. At 40, he was a living example of success in every way. Living in the quiet town of Everbrook, a small place surrounded by hills and dense forests, he stood out as one of the few residents who had made life. His position as financial director of a large multinational company guaranteed him a prestige that went far beyond the city limits. He had achieved more than he thought possible for someone from a small community. Ethan lived in a large house in the suburbs of town, surrounded by trees that changed color with the seasons. The residence was his jewel, a reflection of his success. Solid wood doors, large windows that let the morning sun illuminate the living room, and a large garden well cared for by his wife, Claire. She was the companion he had known in his youth, and together they formed the image of a perfect family. With 2 children, Henry and Olivia, both in school, the house always resonated with laughter sounds and family routine was far from chaotic. It was, for Ethan, the definition of harmony. At work, Ethan was respected and feared. His precise financial decisions kept the company at the top, and his career success was tied to his discipline and control. He spent mornings in meetings and afternoons overseeing detailed reports, making sure that every penny invested generated a significant return. His colleagues admired his coldness, but few knew the weight he carried behind his calculating eyes. On Fridays, Ethan liked to go home early, enjoying the late afternoon with his family. Sat on the porch, drinking a glass of wine, watching their children play in the garden. Claire sometimes joined him, and the two talked about plans for the future, the new house reform, the next vacation, the dreams they still wanted to realize. They were the kind of couple that neighbors envied, appearing to live in perfect balance without great drama or difficulty. Yet, despite the apparent perfection, something silent and unsettling began to form. Ethan, used to having control over everything, sometimes felt a slight discomfort. He never mentioned Claire, but in the last few months, he felt an invisible pressure, as if something was about to come out of place. At work, small financial problems arose, nothing serious, but enough to make him more alert. At the same time, Claire had made some vague comments about feeling distant from him lately, which he quickly ignored, blaming the daily stress. Even so, those moments of doubt were buried under the intense routine. Ethan was moving on with his life, certain that control over everything was still in his hands. On an autumn night, Ethan was back on the balcony, watching the golden leaves fall into the garden. The quietness of the moment should be comforting, but this time it seemed different. The wind, always soft and calm, had a strange sound like whispers in the distance. He tried to ignore, shaking his head, but that feeling of restlessness intensified. His phone vibrated on the table next to him, and when he picked it up, he saw a message from an old college friend, Thomas Wright. He hasn't spoken to Thomas in years, but the message was short and intriguing. "We need to talk. Important things are happening." Ethan frowned, looking at the illuminated screen. Was it just coincidence, or that feeling that something was about to change was finally coming true? That morning began like any other. Ethan woke up before sunrise as usual, had his black coffee and reviewed the emails on his cell phone while still sitting at the kitchen table. Claire was getting ready to take the kids to school and everything seemed in order. The day would be long but predictable, something he liked. On that Friday, he had some important meetings and a crucial decision for a major investment of the company. It was one of those days when he felt that control over everything was in his hands. But as the hours passed, the control began to slip. At about 10 o'clock, Ethan received an unexpected call from one of the company's directors. The voice on the other side was firm, almost impersonal. They had just discovered a financial fraud of unimaginable proportions, and he, as CFO, was the main responsible. A series of documents that had passed his approval contained manipulated information, and the numbers, which were once solid, now appeared to be falsified. The shock ran through Ethan's body like a lightning bolt. In a matter of minutes, he was called to an urgent meeting with the board of directors. When he arrived in the meeting room, the expressions of the present were cold and disapproval. The investigation was ongoing, but evidence already pointed clearly to a financial disaster that put the company at risk. The words summary dismissal and judicial accountability were mentioned bluntly. The abyss that opened under his feet was unfathomable. Ethan tried to argue, explain that he had never seen the altered documents, that it made no sense. But the more he spoke, the more the walls of the room seemed to close around him. He felt small, helpless, like a man fighting against an invisible and unforgiving tide. The director showed no mercy. His career, which he had built with so much effort, crumbled before his eyes. When he came home that night, Ethan felt like a walking corpse. He tried to call Claire, but the line was busy. "All I wanted was to explain to her what had happened, find some solace." When he finally arrived at his home, the silence was more deafening than any word. Claire was sitting in the room, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She held in her hand some papers that he did not recognize immediately until she saw the logo of the bank on top. The house was mortgaged. Ethan's investments, which had previously ensured the comfort and safety of the family, had collapsed. Without him realizing, all the emergency funds had evaporated in failed businesses, and now his home, the refuge where his family grew up, was about to be taken over by the bank. Claire stood up, holding the papers with her trembling hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked in a broken voice. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan. I can't stay here anymore." The words struck Ethan like knives. He tried to explain the chaos at work, the numbers that made no sense, but Claire didn't listen. What was more, the fear was not the financial loss, but the fact that he had hidden the difficulties that were already accumulating for months. For her, that was the last straw. She left that night, taking the children to her mother's house in a nearby town, promising to come back on Monday to discuss the divorce. In the days that followed, Ethan sank into deep despair. He could not get out of bed, the weight of failure crushing him. The phone kept ringing, lawyers, creditors, old colleagues wanting explanations, but he didn't answer. What could he say? His life was falling apart so quickly that he had hardly time to process the sequence of catastrophes. On a gray afternoon, after days of not being able to sleep or eat properly, Ethan walked to the balcony. The dry leaves fell from the trees around the house, but he barely noticed. His mind was clouded, filled with self-destructive thoughts. He felt completely alone, aimless. His family had left, his career was destroyed, and the future looked like a black hole. That evening, when the sun began to set, he made a decision. There was nothing more to be done. Despair consumed him, and he accepted that perhaps his only way out was the end of everything. It was at that moment, in the deepest darkness of his soul, that his phone vibrated. He ignored it, but the insistent touch forced him to look at the screen. It was Thomas Wright again. The same intriguing message from a few days ago. "We need to talk. Important things are happening." Ethan hesitated for a moment. "I had nothing to lose." With his trembling hand, he replied, "I'm listening." Thomas's message moved Ethan in a way he couldn't understand. There was something in the insistence of that communication that seemed wrong, but at the same time, intriguing. They had not spoken for years. Thomas had been a close friend in college, but after a cloudy incident he simply disappeared. No one knew for sure what had happened to him. Rumors said he had been involved in shady business and moved to another city, but there was never any confirmation. Ethan hesitated for a few seconds after replying to the message, but soon the phone vibrated again, now with a direct invitation. "Meet me tomorrow. 21H at the Hollow Bar. We have a lot to talk about." No further explanations. Ethan faced the invitation with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, but the truth was that he was desperate enough to grasp any thread of hope, however strange it might be. That night he could hardly sleep. The image of his life crumbling tormented him, while the idea of finding Thomas seemed to be his last chance to understand what was happening and maybe find a way out. The next day the air was colder than normal for autumn. Ethan arrived at the bar just before the scheduled time, a decadent place on the edge of Everbrook, with dim lighting and low music echoing in the background. The environment was gloomy, frequented by unknown faces, figures who seemed to carry their own burdens and secrets. Thomas was already there, sitting in a secluded corner with a glass of whiskey in his hands. He looked different but at the same time familiar. His clothes were expensive but discreet, and there was something in his gaze that disturbed Ethan, a kind of emptiness, or perhaps a cold indifference he did not remember seeing in the old friend. "You look terrible," said Thomas with a subtle smile, watching Ethan as he approached and sat down at the table. "I heard about everything that happened. The job, the house. Claire." Ethan took a deep breath, not knowing how to start. "How did you know?" was all he could ask, still confused about how Thomas was so aware of his situation. "I have my ways," Thomas replied casually. "But we're not here to talk about how I know. We're here to talk about how you can fix everything." Those words echoed like a cursed promise. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Fix everything? There is no fix. There is no way out." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes shining with a disturbing intensity. "There is, yes. But you must be willing to pay the price." Thomas began to explain that years ago he had also reached the bottom of the pit. His career was in ruins and he was about to lose everything. It was at this moment that he met someone, or something, who offered him a choice. A choice that would give you everything back and more. At first, Ethan thought the friend was referring to some kind of shady business, an illicit opportunity for quick enrichment. But as Thomas continued to speak, It became clear that the subject was much deeper and more terrifying. "I made a pact, Ethan," said Thomas in a low voice, almost in a whisper. "A pact with the devil?" The phrase hovered in the air between them, dense and heavy. Ethan felt his stomach turn. He leaned back, trying to process those words. "Are you serious? Is this some kind of joke?" Thomas shook his head, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "This is no joke. I made a pact and in return got it all back. My life is better than ever. I have money, power, influence. Everything I lost, I recovered, and more." Ethan was silent, feeling the weight of each word. The idea seemed absurd, but something in Thomas's tone of voice, in the way he spoke, left no room for doubt. He looked at the friend, incredulous. "And what was the price?" Thomas gave a faint smile, without a hint of regret. "The soul, of course." "But Ethan, think with me. What is the soul after all? Something you don't even know if it really exists. An abstract concept that people hold on to out of fear. I chose to live in the present, to enjoy what I can while I'm here." Thomas then leaned even closer, and Ethan could smell the strong smell of whiskey mixed with something else, something he couldn't identify. "You can have it all back, Ethan. The company, your family, your home. Everything. But you need to decide now. This type of offer is not available for long." Ethan felt his heart beat faster. Despair was consuming him inside, but there was still a part of himself that resisted. "And what happens next? When, is it all over? Later?" Thomas laughed. "It doesn't matter now. Don't worry about after. Just think about now, about getting everything back. It's your chance to fix everything. Or would you rather stay in this hole, hoping things will get better by themselves, which frankly won't happen?" The silence between the two was almost palpable. Ethan's mind ran, trying to find some logic, some way out. He knew what Thomas was saying was wrong, dangerous. But the promise of getting his life back was so attractive, so tempting, it was hard to resist. Finally, Thomas got up, finishing his whiskey. "Think about it, Ethan. Tomorrow at midnight, at the crossroads near the old cemetery. If you want to make the pact, that's where it will happen." He left a note on the table to pay for drinks and left without looking back. Ethan sat, his head spinning with the implications of what he had just heard. Tomorrow at midnight. The offer was there. The temptation to fix your life, to have everything again. But at what cost? The hours following the meeting with Thomas were the longest in Ethan's life. He was walking around in his empty house, trying to make sense of everything he had heard. The echo of the words, "everything back," did not leave his mind, as a mantra that dragged him deeper and deeper into the abyss. He tried to think rationally, but despair dominated him. Every corner of the house reminded him of his failure. The living room, where the laughter of his children filled the space. The master bedroom, where Claire slept next to him every night, now empty and cold. The kitchen, where he and his wife shared meals and conversations that seemed so distant now. Every detail was a painful reminder of his loss, and what remained was a shadow of who he had already been. And at the same time, Thomas's promise echoed in his mind. He could have it all back. It was just a matter of accepting. Throughout the day, Ethan tried to fight the idea. He knew what he was considering was unthinkable. A pact with the devil, how could that be real? What if it was? Would he be willing to give up his soul, whatever that meant, in exchange for a second chance? As night fell, the doubts began to dissipate. The darkness somehow seemed to amplify his pain and despair. He had already lost everything, his family, his job, his dignity. What else did he have to lose? At 11:30 p.m., Ethan took his coat and left the house. The night wind was sharp and the streets of Everbrook were deserted. The silence of the city seemed to be a warning, as if the air itself was watching his decision with silent disapproval. He walked through the empty streets to the place indicated by Thomas, the intersection near the old cemetery. That place was known for its sinister atmosphere, surrounded by ancient trees and time-worn tombstones. Few people passed through there, especially at night, because the cemetery carried old stories of legends and superstitions. It was Thomas. He was standing in the middle of the intersection, as if he knew exactly what time Ethan would arrive. His smile was enigmatic, and there was something deeply wrong in his presence, something that Ethan had not noticed before. It seemed that somehow Thomas did not belong to the world that Ethan was used to. "I knew you'd come," Thomas said, his voice charged with a strange satisfaction. "You made the right choice, Ethan. Are you ready?" Ethan hesitated. "Is that real?" he asked, the trembling voice. Thomas stepped forward, his dark eyes fixed on Ethan. "Very real. And now there is no turning back." At midnight sharp, the wind stopped blowing. Absolute silence took over the place, creating a feeling of emptiness, as if time itself had been suspended. Suddenly the air seemed to become denser, and Ethan felt a presence, something far beyond anything he could comprehend. It was then that he realized that he was no longer alone. From the shadows among the trees, a figure emerged. Unlike Thomas, this presence was palpable, as if the space itself around her bowed to his will. The figure wore an impeccable suit, and his appearance was disconcertingly ordinary, but there was something in his eyes that was simply wrong. Eyes that did not belong to this world, that contained an inhuman, ancient, and hungry depth. Thomas bowed his head in respect. "He's here, Ethan. This is the moment. You can have it all back, just like I said." The figure approached Ethan slowly, and his voice was as soft as the wind that whispered among the fallen leaves. "Are you ready to make the pact, Ethan Carter?" His voice carried an irresistible authority, but there was a tone that promised as much as it threatened. Ethan's heart was beating wildly, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He knew he was crossing a line that could not be undone, but the promise of his life back dragged him irresistibly. He thought of Claire, of the children, of the life he had lost, and felt the temptation to wrap his heart like a chain. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm ready." The figure smiled, a smile that was not human, but filled with something beyond any known emotion. "Very well then. The covenant will be sealed. In exchange for your soul, you will receive everything you have lost, and more. But remember, Ethan, when your time comes, you will come to me. No matter where you are, no matter what you do, you will come." Ethan swallowed dry, but his mind was fixed on the present, not the future. He was blinded by the desire for recovery, by the desire to erase failure. "I accept." With a simple movement, the figure reached out. The air around them seemed to vibrate with an invisible energy. When Ethan shook hands with the figure, a wave of intense cold swept through his body, as if his own spirit was being pulled away, but he did not resist. The hand of the figure moved away, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to shine in a distorted way, as if reality had bent to that covenant. "It's done," said the figure, his voice now as cold as ice. With this, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving only Thomas and Ethan in the middle of the intersection. Thomas, with a satisfied look, approached Ethan and patted him on the back. "Congratulations, friend. Your life will change now. Enjoy what comes." Ethan felt a void inside him, as if something important had been torn out. But what remained was the promise of tomorrow, and for now, that was all that mattered. The first days after the pact were a roller coaster of emotions. For Ethan, everything seemed to change almost instantly. He woke up the next morning, and looking out of the window, the sunlight seemed brighter, as if the world was painted in more vivid colors. There was a new energy in his being, a sense of renewal that propelled him. At work, things began to unfold in a favorable way. Ethan received a call from his former company, offering him a high-ranking position. The turn was so unexpected that he almost did not believe. He was back at the center of his professional life, a respected executive with influence and power. His family, who had been away, began to come closer again. Claire and the children seemed happy to see him well, and this fed their ego. However, as the days went by, Ethan began to notice a strange disconnect. He often saw himself lost in dark thoughts, a distant echo of the despair he had felt before. And as perfect as everything around him seemed, there was a persistent emptiness within him, as if his soul were slowly being drained. One day, while reviewing reports in the conference room, Ethan was paralyzed by a vision, his reflection on the glass window. There was something different in his eyes, a darkness that seemed to bubble under the surface. He blinked and the image disappeared. When he turned, he saw Thomas watching him from the corner of the room, a subtle smile on his lips. "You're shining, Ethan," said Thomas, his words as melodic as they are hypnotic. "The pact is working." Ethan nodded, but he couldn't get rid of the unsettling feeling that accompanied him. "Yes, but there is something that worries me." Thomas came up, eyes full of deep understanding. "Don't worry about it. What matters is what you have now. You have a new life, a new chance. Enjoy." As the days turned into weeks, Ethan realized that it was not only his life that was recovering, but also the lives of those around him. His friends and colleagues seemed to notice the change and began to crowd around him, attracted by his new aura of power. And then, something strange began to happen. One by one, those who approached him started having small lucky drops. A co-worker who had been injured at work, a friend who lost a job offer, and even some neighbors who were facing financial difficulties. Every time Ethan heard about the misfortunes of others, a little sinister pleasure grew inside him. It was as if, in some way, his ascension was linked to the suffering of others. He tried to drive away these thoughts, but they were like shadows that did not leave him alone. One night, while sitting alone in his house, Ethan received a message from Thomas. "Remember, Ethan, you must feed the covenant." Ethan frowned. "Feed the pact?" he replied, feeling a chill in his spine. The answer came quickly. "Yes. What you want to receive has a price. And every desire of yours, however much it brings joy, also consumes something. Life is made of exchanges." The unease grew inside Ethan. He remembered the last time he saw Thomas, when the friend had said that the pact would bring consequences. The words now resounded with a deep and terrifying meaning. The atmosphere in his house began to change. At night, Ethan heard whispers. It was not screams, but whispers very low, almost imperceptible, that seemed to come from the walls. He wondered if he was imagining things, but could not ignore the feeling that there was something more there, a presence that observed and judged him. One night, while the family was sleeping, he went down to the living room, unable to bear the whispers. He sat on the couch, lights out, and tried to concentrate. That's when he saw his own image reflected in the window. His eyes were now darker, and he felt a wave of despair as he noticed that something was changing inside him. There was a weight on his conscience, a feeling that he had crossed a line he should not have. When he closed his eyes, a shudder ran through his spine, and a vision appeared. A figure emerging from the shadows, the same one who had made the pact with him, with a smile that promised much and at the same time terrified. "You can't ignore the price, Ethan. Every blessing comes with a curse. Remember that." Ethan opened his eyes, breathing fast. The night was quiet again, but the feeling that something terrible was about to happen accompanied him. He stood up, determined to change things, to regain control. But in the back of his mind a voice whispered, "You made the choice. Now it's time to live with the consequences." Days turned into weeks, and Ethan began to realize that the life he had regained was not what it looked like. Every success, every family laugh seemed to come with an invisible cost. The consequences of his covenant began to unfold, like a storm approaching on the horizon. One morning, Ethan woke up with a feeling of apprehension. The atmosphere in his house was heavy, as if the house itself were aware of his dark choice. Looking out the window, he noticed that a neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, was sitting on the sidewalk with her eyes seared. Curious, he decided to go to her. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. Is everything all right?" he asked, trying to keep the cordiality. "No, darling, it's not," she replied, her voice trembling. "My husband suffered a heart attack tonight. He was fine, until now. I'm in shock." Ethan's heart shot. What was mere chance now seemed a connection to his own decisions. He said goodbye quickly, but the sense of guilt accompanied him, like a ghost that did not leave him alone. In the following days, the wave of misfortune spread through Everbrook. A fire devastated the local restaurant, a close friend lost his job without explanation, and a child in the neighborhood fell seriously ill. Ethan tried to ignore the growing anxiety that consumed him, but the connection between the tragic events and his pact was becoming undeniable. The nights became more and more disturbing. Ethan began to have vivid and disturbing nightmares, where the figure who had made him the pact appeared, shrouded in shadows. "You're forgetting who you are," she whispered. "What you desire has a price. Don't forget it." Each time he woke up, he was covered in sweat, and the feeling that his own soul was being devoured became more intense. He felt lost in a vicious cycle of guilt and success, and did not know how to get out. That night, as he was getting ready to sleep, he heard a noise coming from upstairs. He got up, restless, and went up the stairs. The sound sounded like a whisper echoing on the walls. As he approached the children's room, the whisper intensified, turning into voices. He stopped at the door, his heart beating fast. "Daddy?" The voice of the daughter, Emily, called softly from inside the room. He opened the door, and the scene before him left him paralyzed. Emily and her brother, Lucas, were sitting in bed with their eyes wide open. Fear was stamped on their faces. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "There's something in my room," Emily said, pointing to the dark corner of the room. "I heard whispers, Dad. He was here." Ethan turned, looking at the corner of the room, but there was nothing. Or maybe there was. A shadow seemed to writhe in the dark, and the feeling that he was not alone seized him. From that night on, the presence began to manifest more frequently. Ethan felt the shadows follow him, and whispers became a constant. He wondered if there was something in his house, something that was connected to the covenant he had made. The guilt for his decision now haunted him so much that he could no longer distinguish what was real and what was the fruit of his tormented mind. "I need to do something," he muttered to himself as he walked around the house in search of answers. "This can't go on like this." He decided to look for Thomas, hoping that his friend could offer a solution. The meeting was scheduled for the next day, but anxiety consumed Ethan until then. When he finally arrived at the bar where Thomas used to meet, a feeling of despair took hold of him. Thomas greeted him with a smile. "Ethan, my friend, you look exhausted. The pact is working, right?" "It's not that simple," Ethan said, his voice stuck. "Things are getting worse. The people around me are suffering, and my children are seeing things. There is something wrong." Thomas frowned, the expression changing. "You knew there was a price to pay. What you desire does not come without consequences. You need to remember that every desire needs to be fed." "But how?" Ethan was almost in tears. "What do I do?" Thomas looked around as if he wanted to make sure no one was listening. "Maybe you need to sacrifice something or someone. To keep the pact, balance needs to be restored. Think about what you are willing to lose." Ethan felt the pressure grow in his chest. What was he willing to sacrifice? The idea of hurting those he loved horrified him, but the weight of guilt and despair pushed him into an abyss of unthinkable decisions. He left the bar with a confused mind, the feeling that everything he loved was about to fall apart. He was stuck in a game that he did not understand, and the only way out seemed to be tied to more sacrifices. When he arrived home, the darkness seemed more dense. The whispers had intensified and now were almost deafening, as if the walls of the house were screaming. He sat in bed, his head between his hands, feeling that he was losing his sanity. "Ethan," Emily's voice cut through the darkness, and he looked at his daughter who was standing at the door. "Are you all right?" He forced a smile. "Yes, dear. I'm just a little tired." But as she watched him, he knew that things would never be the same. The covenant with the devil had given him a new life, but it had also sown chaos in everything he loved. And now he wondered if he could face the consequences of his choices. Weeks passed and Ethan's life seemed like a nightmare from which he could not wake up. The echoes of the covenant surrounded him at every moment, making the house that had once been a home in a maze of fear and despair. He no longer knew what was real. The line between good and evil had become blurred, and the murmur of darkness that permeated his mind did not leave him. On a dark night, Ethan decided he couldn't continue like this. The idea of sacrificing something he loved consumed him, but the prospect of losing everything he had won terrorized him even more. He needed answers and remembered the stories he had heard about people who had made covenants and found ways to reverse their destinies. He remembered the legends about rituals and ways to undo what had been done. But for this, he would have to take a risk and confront once again with the obscure figure who had signed the pact with him. That night, when everyone was sleeping, Ethan prepared. He lit candles in the basement of the house, the most remote and forgotten place where the darkness was denser. The atmosphere was charged, and every crack of the wooden floor seemed a warning that he was about to cross a line without return. Ethan recited the words he had found in an old book, his heart beating hard in his chest. He was determined to break the bond, to free himself from the weight that oppressed him. But as the words came out of his mouth, a presence began to materialize, filling the space around him. "Ethan," the soft, seductive voice echoed in the darkness. "What do you think you're doing?" The figure appeared, shrouded in shadows, the gaze penetrating as an abyss. Fear took hold of him, but determination drove him to proceed. "I don't want it anymore. I want to undo the pact." The smile on the face was both inviting and terrifying. "Do you think you can just undo a deal with the devil? Every wish you made, every life you have lost, everything has a price. I don't care. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get my life back." Ethan screamed, adrenaline pumping in his veins. The figure bent down, the shadow around her dancing as if she were alive. "To undo the covenant, you will have to sacrifice something valuable. Something that has a deep meaning." "No, I can't." Ethan hesitated, the reality of his words hitting him like a blow. The thought of losing what he loved paralyzed him. He thought of Claire, the children, and the pain that he had already caused. "I can't do this." When he finally opened his eyes, he was back in his room. Daylight filtered through the windows and everything seemed normal. But as he looked around, a shiver ran through his spine. Something was different, something he could not identify. He stood up and went to the mirror. When he saw it, the expression on his face was of a divided man, a look that mixed hope and despair. What he had done or failed to do echoed in his mind. Ethan heard a distant laugh, an echo of something that was not completely human. Deep down, he knew the battle was not over. The covenant was fulfilled, but the real struggle had only begun. He left home, determined to face the consequences, but the doubt remained. What had he really sacrificed? What did it really mean to be free? And above all, who or what was watching him from the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to claim what belonged to him?